I didn't even know my life could change in a single morning until I signed the papers. I remember staring at the stark white sheets on the mahogany desk and thinking, this looks official enough. My last job had been dull, predictable, and painfully safe. I came from a town so small that even rumors traveled slower than the county post, a place where a girl like me, quiet, observant, careful, could disappear entirely if she wanted. My parents had instilled caution like a second skin. Trust was a luxury, and love, if it existed, was only for stories in dog-eared novels. I had no reason to imagine a man like him would ever intersect with my carefully constructed life. The office itself was intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that glimmered with impossible wealth. I had applied for a position as a research coordinator at Mistral Pharmaceuticals, a company rumored to be both a pioneer and a predator in the industry. I never expected to meet the CEO in person, certainly not on my first day. I didn't notice him at first. He stepped from the shadows of the corner office like a thought I didn't know I had. His presence was deliberate and unhurried, his gray hair perfectly trimmed, his suit as crisp as the air-conditioned room. I froze, papers trembling slightly in my hand, the NDA already half signed. You know what these papers mean? His voice was low, controlled, but carried an edge that made my chest tighten. I think so, I stammered. Though I hadn't read them. I never read legal documents if I could avoid it. They were meant to protect someone else's interests, not mine. He came closer, each step measured, and I realized I hadn't been aware of how tense my shoulders had become. Signing without reading them is careless, he said, though his eyes were studying me, not angrily, but curiously, as if he were cataloging each small movement. And dangerous, I swallowed. I just wanted to start. I need this job. His gaze softened slightly, but it didn't lose its intensity. Most people want to work here because they see opportunity. You seem desperate. The word hit harder than I expected. Desperate. I wasn't desperate. I was cautious, careful, and polite. But I also knew I couldn't back out now. My life had always been controlled by circumstance. But here, I had a chance. No, a choice. Sometimes choice requires a leap, I whispered, more to myself than to him. He studied me for a long beat. Then, abruptly, he gestured toward the corner chair. Sit. I obeyed, and the hum of the city outside the glass walls filled the silence. He perched on the edge of the desk, hands clasped loosely, as if he were weighing something much heavier than the conversation we were having. I don't usually meet new employees, but you caught my attention. That rarely happens. I nodded, trying to appear calm when every nerve in my body screamed otherwise. Thank you, sir. The word sounded small in that cavernous office, swallowed by the weight of his presence. You're from a small town, he stated, not asked. I flinched, surprised. How did he know? My life was usually invisible to anyone who wasn't paying very close attention. Yes, I admitted, and you're cautious. You measure everything, yet here you are, signing without reading, entering a world you don't understand. I swallowed hard, feeling my pulse in my throat. I needed the job, I repeated. Simple truth. That was all I had. A ghost of a smile crossed his face, fleeting and precise. Most people would walk away from a challenge like this. But you walk in. Something inside me fluttered, a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. This man, this 43-year-old mogul, exuded control. Not arrogance, exactly. Control. And he was studying me as if I were a chess piece, though I suspected he didn't realize that I was already observing him just as intently. You'll have to stay on site for the first few weeks, he said suddenly. It's standard for compliance. You'll be under direct supervision. My stomach tightened. I wasn't a visitor. I was a guest in a cage of his making. Yet somehow the idea of being in proximity to him, living in the same controlled environment, breathing the same air, thrilled me in a way I couldn't name. I understand, I said. Good, he replied, leaning back slightly. You'll learn quickly whether you can handle this, and whether I can handle you. The words settled over me like a fog. He didn't say them with menace, though a part of me wanted to believe he did. No, it was something else entirely. A promise of tension, a challenge, and a vulnerability that I wasn't allowed to touch yet. Leaving the office, I felt both exhilarated and unnerved. His presence lingered, like the echo of a chord struck too deeply. I walked the city streets in a daze, taking in the anonymity and movement that contrasted with the still, calculated intensity of that office. The city felt enormous and indifferent, yet in some inexplicable way it was now the stage for my new life, one dictated by rules I didn't fully understand. That night, I couldn't sleep. I traced the contours of his face in my mind. Sharp jaw, steel gray eyes, and the subtle vulnerability hidden beneath his meticulous composure. I had spent my life protecting myself, avoiding exposure, yet the idea of proximity to him stirred something restless inside me. I didn't know what it was. Desire? Curiosity? The thrill of being tested? But it was there, and it refused to be ignored. By morning, the reality of the situation hit me. I was about to enter a world I hadn't chosen, one filled with rules, scrutiny, and danger disguised as opportunity. My transportation arrived, a sleek black sedan, tinted windows, driver silent but aware, and I stepped into the car, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Somewhere between nervousness and defiance, I realized I was ready to enter his world. Not because I wanted to impress him, not because I wanted approval, but because for the first time, I wanted to see what I could handle. The ride to the Mistral estate was surreal. The city blurred into streaks of sunlight and reflection on steel towers. The estate itself emerged suddenly, an architectural marvel of glass, stone, and sweeping balconies, perched like a crown over the skyline. Security gates opened silently, admitting us to a world that was simultaneously luxurious and sterile. I spent the car ride rehearsing my composure. I had always been careful, never revealing too much, never trusting too quickly. But something about him, about the invisible hand of authority and scrutiny in this place, made me want to be seen, not just as an employee, but as a person who could stand firm even in a world where most were bent and broken. Stepping out onto the polished marble floors of the estate, I felt an unexpected surge of something foreign, anticipation. This place was a gilded cage, yes, but for the first time I felt ready to test its limits. The staff greeted me politely. The corridors smelled faintly of antiseptic and cedar, and yet every detail whispered control. He appeared, as if conjured, standing at the end of the hallway. Gray hair, tailored suit, the same piercing gaze. "Welcome," he said simply. "Thank you," I replied, heart hammering in my chest. He nodded once, a brief, almost imperceptible acknowledgement, and turned away. I realized in that moment that nothing about this place or him was casual. Everything was deliberate. Every glance, every movement, every word measured and weighted, and yet I wanted to understand it, to navigate it, to belong, even just a little. By the time the evening settled over the estate, I found myself in my temporary quarters. Minimalist, elegant, untouched by personal life. I unpacked slowly, every motion careful, measured. My parents' lessons echoed in my mind. Caution first, trust later. Yet for the first time, the caution seemed to mix with something else. Hope, perhaps. Or curiosity, or the faintest spark of daring. Because the man I would come to rely on, and who would come to rely on me, was not just a mogul, not just a figure of authority, but someone who had built walls around his heart so high that even he didn't know how to scale them. And somehow, I knew that somewhere in those walls, I might find the key to unlocking his vulnerabilities. And he, unknowingly, would become my greatest challenge, my greatest fear, and my unexpected weakness. That night, I lay awake in a room that was not my own, listening to the distant hum of the city and the occasional click of staff footsteps, feeling for the first time that I was exactly where I needed to be, not in control, not entirely safe, but ready to learn the rules of a world that promised wealth, scrutiny, and the subtle danger of a man who considered me a controlled asset, until perhaps unknowingly I became his weakness. Living under the same roof as him was unlike anything I'd imagined. The estate was immaculate, silent in ways that made every creak of the floorboards and shuffle of a shoe feel amplified. I quickly realized that my every movement, my every breath, seemed to be catalogued in the invisible ledger of his attention. He didn't hover. Not exactly. He merely existed, a constant, controlled presence that made the air itself feel taut. At first, I was hyper-aware of boundaries. I walked through hallways as if on a tightrope, careful not to intrude, careful not to reveal too much. I worked hard in the labs, meticulous in my reports, in my handling of chemicals in the smallest of details, and yet, I couldn't escape the feeling that he was always somewhere in the periphery, watching, assessing, not as a supervisor, but almost as a guardian of some fragile rule I didn't understand. He was a man who demanded control over everything, from company finances to the arrangement of books in his study. And yet, when it came to people, his control seemed even more profound and even more fragile. I learned that by observing him quietly, by noticing the slight hesitation in his smile when a junior employee made a mistake, or the brief tension in his jaw when confronted with an unpredicted result, I could see a man who had built walls so high he might have forgotten what lay behind them. It wasn't easy being around him. Every glance felt loaded, every word weighed, and yet, slowly, I began to notice the cracks in that armor, subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. There was the moment I arrived early to the lab one morning and found him already there, reviewing charts. I thought he hadn't seen me, but he did, and for a heartbeat, his expression softened, almost gentle, before the practiced mask of authority returned. "You're early," he said, voice low, measured. "I like quiet," I replied, though my heart raced, knowing the proximity of him was enough to set it off. He studied me for a long moment, one eyebrow slightly raised. "Quiet suits you, but don't mistake it for weakness." I felt a flicker of defiance. "I don't." And that was the pattern we settled into. Small, verbal duels, glances that lingered too long, moments of shared silence that felt heavier than words could convey. I began to see him not just as a man of control, but as someone who feared losing it, someone who feared being exposed, vulnerable, perhaps even soft. One evening, we ended up in the library together. I had brought a pile of research papers to review, and he had come in to check a data set. The room smelled faintly of leather and old wood, the lighting muted, and the quiet felt different here. It wasn't sharp or tense. It was intimate in a way I couldn't name. "Do you always work this late?" I asked, trying for casualness. He didn't look at me immediately, instead scanning the pages before him. "Only when it's necessary." His hand paused over a chart, then moved with careful deliberation. "You'll learn that sometimes the right path requires patience and observation." I nodded, pretending the flutter in my chest wasn't there. "I can wait," I said. A flicker of something, approval, amusement, passed through his gaze. He returned to the papers, but the air between us had shifted, charged with an unspoken acknowledgement that we were both aware of the tension, and that neither of us would break it, not yet. It wasn't just the hours we shared. It was the small, almost accidental proximity. I'd catch him lingering at the doorway when I entered a room. He would pause at my side to glance at a chart, his shoulder brushing mine ever so slightly, and I would feel the smallest spark of connection, then pull back quickly, reminding myself why I couldn't let it become anything else. And yet, I couldn't ignore the way his presence affected me. My heart would tighten at a brief look, my palms would sweat at a fleeting touch, and I realized I was learning him the way I had never learned anyone before. By quiet observation, by careful attention, by noticing the cracks beneath the armor. I also began to notice him noticing me. He would make small allowances, moments that could pass unnoticed by anyone else. A door held open a second longer, a cup of tea brought without being asked, a comment about my work that carried subtle encouragement. He was a man who rarely let anyone in, yet here he was, allowing me to inhabit the edges of his controlled world. Then came the night that changed something. I had caught a cold, mild but relentless, and found myself in the study trying to force myself through reports. He appeared without knocking, holding a small thermos and a folded blanket. "You need rest," he said simply. I tried to decline, embarrassed by my weakness. "I can manage." "You can manage the company, but not yourself," he replied. His tone was dry, but there was no reprimand, no superiority, only concern. My chest tightened. Here was the man who controlled every aspect of his world, showing care not because it was expected, but because he wanted to. I accepted the blanket, felt the warmth of it against my arms, and for the first time, allowed myself to admit that I trusted him. Not fully, not blindly, but enough to let my guard slip for a moment. He stayed long enough to make sure I had tea, then left, his departure as deliberate as his entrance. I realized I had waited for him to leave just to release the tension I hadn't even noticed I was holding. The weeks passed, and the pattern continued. Work, proximity, shared silences, small exchanges of care. Each time I saw a softer edge to him, I felt my own defenses crumble, even as I reminded myself that he was still dangerous, still guarded, still a man who saw me as an asset to manage. Then there was the late evening in the greenhouse, where we both found ourselves checking on experimental plant samples. The air was warm and fragrant, humid, and I realized with a start that I was standing closer to him than strictly necessary. He bent to inspect a leaf, and I instinctively mirrored him, our knees brushing lightly. "I can move," I said quickly. Stepping back. "You don't need to," he said, almost a whisper without looking up. I froze, feeling my heartbeat accelerate. The air between us was thick, charged with unspoken questions and hesitations. He finally straightened, our eyes meeting, and the intensity was impossible to ignore. For a fleeting second, I saw the vulnerability beneath his control. A man aware of his attraction, aware of the risk, yet unwilling to give in entirely. "I should go," I said, more to steady myself than because I wanted to leave. He didn't move to stop me. He simply nodded and I left, carrying the weight of the moment with me. The realization struck me hard. I was becoming his weakness, not just because I existed, but because I was brave enough to be seen. And in turn, I was learning that I wanted to be his. Not possession, not submission, but trusted, relied upon, allowed into the places no one else could reach. It terrified me, the idea of being vulnerable in his presence, yet also exhilarated me. The tension grew steadily, subtle but unrelenting. A glance lingered too long. A hand brushed my papers as he reached for something else. A shared silence stretched over a lab bench or the balcony. Each moment was a test, a negotiation, a step toward a connection that neither of us could openly name. Then came a misunderstanding that brought everything to a head. I had stayed late one night, reviewing data alone, when he entered abruptly, assuming I had overstepped a protocol. His voice was sharp, controlled, his posture rigid. I braced myself, expecting reprimand. Instead, after a long, charged pause, he sighed, the tension leaving his shoulders almost imperceptibly. "I shouldn't have assumed," he admitted quietly. You handle yourself well. Better than I expected." Something shifted in that moment. The walls we had both maintained, the careful distance, the tension, the restraint, felt suddenly permeable. We were aware of what was growing between us, though neither of us named it aloud. By the end of Act 2, I understood the truth of our dynamic. He was a man who feared intimacy, who feared being unguarded, and I was a woman who had learned to navigate both caution and trust. We were circling each other, almost touching, almost confessing, bound by proximity, by shared responsibility, and by the subtle, undeniable draw that neither of us could fully resist. And somewhere deep inside, I realized that the next step, crossing the threshold from almost touch to trust, from guarded affection to surrender, would require courage, honesty, and a willingness to confront the vulnerability we both feared. The estate was quieter than usual that evening, the city lights dimmed behind a haze of late summer heat. I was in the greenhouse, reviewing data from the day's experiments, when I heard the front door click open. My chest tightened. Somehow, even after weeks of coexisting, I could recognize the sound of his arrival without seeing him. He appeared in the doorway, the soft lamplight catching his gray hair, highlighting the sharp lines of his face. He looked unsettled. That wasn't something I had ever seen in him before. Even at his most approachable, he had always exuded control, a calm authority. But now, I could sense something fragile beneath the surface. "You're still here," he said, his voice low but strained. I I wanted to finish some notes, I replied, keeping my tone steady, though my stomach knotted. He stepped closer, and I felt the familiar tension in the air, the unspoken distance we had been circling. "There's been an incident," he said abruptly, voice clipped. "A breach. Someone tried to access confidential research. You weren't involved, but—" His eyes met mine, and for a moment he seemed unsure, almost human in a way I hadn't seen before. "I need to know I can trust the people in this house." I swallowed hard. "You can trust me," I said quietly. "I haven't—" "You're not just saying that," he interrupted gently, almost pleading. "I can see it in the way you've carried yourself. But trust isn't enough anymore. I need to know you. With me." The word struck me. With him. Not in compliance, not as an employee, not as someone under his control, but fully present. I realized then that the slow burn, the tension, the small hesitations and almost touch, had all been leading to this fragile precipice. I want to be," I whispered. My hands trembled slightly and he noticed. I could see it in his eyes. A flash of raw concern, something unguarded. "Then stay here," he said. "Tonight, just stay." We moved through the greenhouse, an unspoken agreement guiding our steps. The warm air, scented with soil and blooms, seemed to cocoon us, shielding us from the rest of the world. I felt a flutter of fear. This was more than proximity. This was intimacy, the kind that left you raw, exposed, trusting someone completely. He reached for my hand, not aggressively, not demanding, but as a question. A silent invitation. I hesitated for a heartbeat, heart hammering. Then slowly I let him hold it. His hand was steady, grounding, and in that small touch, I felt the weight of the weeks we had shared, the glances, the quiet gestures, the late nights of mutual observation, converging into something real. "Do you trust me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I breathed, though I felt my voice break slightly. "I trust you." He didn't move closer immediately. He stayed just far enough away that I could choose the next step. I realized in that moment that he had been waiting for me to act, to choose this surrender consciously. Slowly, deliberately, I leaned in. Not a rush, not a demand, but a careful movement of willingness. His eyes softened, and the corner of his mouth twitched into a fleeting smile before he lowered his face toward mine. It was tentative at first, a brush of lips, a question more than a statement. I felt a thrill run through me, a mixture of fear and relief. Then, gently, he held me closer, and I allowed myself to breathe into him, to feel the warmth of his chest beneath my cheek. We pulled back slightly, foreheads touching, breathing mingling. "You've become my weakness," he murmured, almost ashamed, almost afraid to say it aloud. "I've spent years controlling everything, and you—" He shook his head faintly, incredulity and awe in his tone. "You're not controlled. You're alive. You're real." I felt tears prick my eyes, and I realized that he had seen me, not just the careful, measured exterior I had presented, but the girl behind the walls, the one who had learned to navigate life with caution, and yet dared to trust. "I've never let anyone see me like this," he admitted, voice rough with emotion. "Not like this. I'm here," I whispered, letting the words carry more than reassurance. They carried my choice, my presence, my willingness to be vulnerable with him. We spent the night talking quietly in the greenhouse, sharing pieces of ourselves we had kept hidden. He spoke of the losses and betrayals that had shaped him, the reasons he had built walls so high that even he had feared falling alone. I spoke of my upbringing, the small town, the cautious life I had led, the self-imposed rules I had lived by. Each revelation was a thread, weaving us together in trust. And then at dawn, something shifted. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but gently, irrevocably. He cupped my face in his hands, and for the first time, I felt his touch without tension, without hesitation. It was not about possession. It was not about dominance. It was about safety, about mutual surrender, about two people meeting in the space between fear and trust, and choosing each other. "I want this to be slow," he said softly. "I want to learn you, every part of you, And you can learn me if you want, but no rush. Only trust, I nodded, my lips trembling into a smile. I want that too. Only trust. The days that followed were quiet, tender, filled with careful closeness. We learned the rhythms of each other's presence, the brush of a hand across a table, the shared silence over breakfast, the lingering glances when one thought the other wasn't watching. And yet, in that restraint, there was freedom. Freedom to feel, to care, to be vulnerable without fear. Then came the moment that truly sealed our connection. He led me to the private study, a room suffused with warm light, lined with books, comfortable and intimate. He took my hands, and for the first time we moved beyond tentative touches. There was no rush, no spectacle. Only the recognition that this was safe, that this was mutual, that this was real. I felt the last layers of caution fall away. I trust you completely, I said, voice steady, though my heart raced. And I want you to trust me too. He nodded, and in that moment, there was no hierarchy, no corporate boundary, no control. Only two people, meeting in the shared space of vulnerability, of choice, of mutual care. The sun rose slowly behind the windows, spilling light over the bookshelves, the polished wood floors, and the small corner where we stood, wrapped in each other's presence. I realized that love wasn't about possession or control. It was about transformation, about two people once careful and guarded, learning to be brave together. And as I leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his steady heartbeat beneath my cheek, I knew that the walls we had each built around ourselves had not crumbled in chaos or force. They had opened. Willingly, in trust, I had become his weakness, and in letting him see me fully, I had discovered that he was mine. But this was not dependency, not submission. It was mutual, deliberate, conscious surrender to the slow, steady pull of connection that neither of us could deny. We stayed that morning in silence, speaking only in touches and soft breaths, and in that quiet, I understood something essential. Love is not about control. It is about safety. It is about trust. It is about the courage to reveal your most fragile self, and to accept the fragility of another. And for the first time in my life, I felt completely safe, completely seen, completely loved. If you enjoyed this emotional, slow-burn romance, subscribe to never miss a new story. Comment below your favorite moment. Was it their first vulnerable conversation, the greenhouse tension, or their final surrender? Share this story with friends who love heartfelt, mature romances. Every comment and share helps me bring more stories of love, trust, and emotional intimacy to life. Your favorite moments might even inspire the next story.